As I mentioned, I'm Miranda Hitchcock. I'm the founder of Every Dog Behavior and Training. We are a nonprofit in the Austin area that is dedicated to making accessible and inclusive training for folks in our community. But obviously, there are lots of folks that attend our webinars who aren't in Austin as well. So we're really all about trying to make it possible for people to get access to really good professional dog training. We know it can be really expensive. It's not always possible for everyone to get access to it. So we want to make sure that we provide what we can there. So today we're here to talk about treats, and we get this all the time where we hear people say, my dog just isn't treat motivated. And there are genuinely some dogs who are not that into treats. But in general, we find that pretty much every dog is treat motivated. We may just have a problem in terms of what we're using for treats, what's kind of going on in the environment, some other things that might be getting in the way of using treats effectively. So where do we really start with this? And I want to give you guys a heads up that we are going to be talking about a mix of things today. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of the science side of how we use reinforcement, how we use treats, all that kind of thing. And we're going to talk about more specifics for working with our own pet dogs at home. So keep in mind, it'll be a mix of a little bit of both, but it should be really fun. This is a really exciting topic, and it's something that we talk about a lot. So why do we use food in the first place? There are a number of different reinforcers that we have. There are different ways that we can reward our dogs and help them decide to do certain behaviors more often. So food is a really easy one. It's one of our called primary reinforcers. These are things that we don't have to condition. We don't have to teach them these things are good. There are things that our dogs already really like that are kind of inherently good things for them. It's really quick and easy. So there are some kinds of rewards that might take longer. Food, it's really easy to give a single piece of something and then move on to the next behavior versus something that might take longer. And we have to feed our dogs anyway. So we know that they need to take in nutritional value through food. We might as well use this to our advantage by using treats and food in training. So yes, there are other options. I want to be really clear that food is not the only thing that motivates our dogs, but a lot of the other primary reinforcers we have access to, like play, water, toys, petting, sex. Some of these things are much harder or easier to manage, but food tends to be the easiest one for us. There are also conditioned reinforcers. These are things that maybe inherently are not that exciting, but once we've paired them with something really fun, like maybe a leash predicts going for a walk, those other things can become conditioned reinforcers as well. So we do have a bunch of things at our disposal, but food is really valuable when we do training. And so if we say my dog is not treat motivated, oh, that makes a lot of our options more limited. So we want to talk about ways that we can use treats whenever possible. So what's the problem? There are a lot of reasons why our dogs might not be taking treats, and it's really important to know what the problem is before we just say, my dog's not into treats, treats don't work for my dog, etc. So sometimes we have dogs that just are not particularly into food. Sometimes we have dogs that are finicky eaters. You have to kind of coax them to eat their food, or maybe they're not feeling great and they're not really wanting to eat much at all. Maybe they won't take treats outside when there's squirrels and dogs and all kinds of other things out there. Maybe they have a special diet or allergies that make it so that you can't feed them things that you'd like to. And maybe the human has allergies or diet preferences that make it a little trickier to use what we normally think of as treats. We are also concerned about fitness and weight gain. We don't want our dogs to suddenly look like, Ottoman stools just because we're doing training. We also have dogs that are really sharky when taking treats, where that can be an issue. We have different scenarios where maybe we can't give treats in the same way. And we have dogs that are really short and it's hard to give them treats. And so there are a lot of reasons why we might be struggling to get our dog to take treats, especially in the situations where we want them to. So we are going to be looking at a whole bunch of different things depending on what that situation is. I'm also going to warn you, my dog is noisily eating a bully stick in the background, but if there's noise in our apartment complex, you might hear her barking. So one of the first things is, if you're noticing that your dog is not feeling well, they're not eating like normal, they're a really picky eater, there's been a change in their appetite, any kind of allergy and illness, the first thing you want to do is talk to your vet. So when it comes to what your dog is allowed to eat, that is a thing that you should be talking to your vet about. And when it comes to changes in diet, or if they're not eating very well, that is absolutely a thing to talk to your vet about. This is not a training issue. If your dog's not eating at all, that's a big problem, or if they're eating significantly less than normal. So with any of these things, if your dog fits into kind of these types of categories, talk to your vet before your trainer. These are things that we want to make sure are ruled out. You know, we can give you all the best tips and tricks out there, but if your dog is not feeling well, that has to start with a vet check. One of the common things that we work with a lot, you know, once our vet visit is done, is that we have difficulty using the right value of our reinforcers. So one of the best things I often compare it to is that we know what jobs or what things are worth certain amounts of money. If you get asked to do something, you know, for an hour to help out a friend, maybe you're willing to do that for some slices of pizza and a drink. If you're asked to do something for a year of your life, you're going to expect maybe a paycheck for it. There are certain things that we understand are inherently worth more, and you're going to have to pay us more to do them. And our dogs are absolutely the same. So our dogs can do what I like to call doggy math, which is just that they understand the value of different reinforcers. And so we have to be really cautious to make sure that we're rewarding enough for what we're asking of them. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but just keep in mind that our dogs are smart enough to know kind of what they're worth or what some behavior might be worth. And that can make our lives much easier or much harder, depending on how willing we are to think about it. So there are a bunch of different things that impact the value of our treats on our dogs. So the first thing I have here on the left is that we could have a couple treats, or we could have a lot of treats. Our dogs totally know the difference between getting, you know, one piece of kibble versus a whole bunch of kibble. They know the difference between one and many, or some and many. The other thing is that they definitely know the magnitude. So they can tell, you know, is this a small little piece of something, or is this a big piece of something? That is a much bigger reward. And then on the right-hand side here, we know that different things inherently have a different value to your dog. So for example, my dog thinks kibble is tasty, but she's not really going to do much behavior for it. It's not that exciting. And if we're outside, she is not going to do anything for kibble. It is not exciting enough. But if we bring out the hot dogs, she's much more likely to be excited. So when we think about treats and giving treats, we need to make sure we're giving enough of them. We need to make sure we're giving big enough treats, and that depends a lot on what we're working with, and that we're giving the right kinds of treats. So there are a lot of things that we can do to change the value of the treats that we're using. Sometimes this comes into play if we're doing things like a jackpot, where we're trying to tell the dog, yes, oh my gosh, you did something so amazing just now. Maybe they finally get a behavior and we give them a bunch of treats instead of just the normal one treat or two treats. So there are things like that that we can do when we're rewarding behavior. So when it comes to really high value treats, a lot of times when I work with folks, they say, you know, oh, he won't listen to me outside when I've got treats. And I say, well, what are you using? And they say, well, I'm using, you know, regular dog treats, or I'm using little Beggin' strips or something else like that. And what I say is, if we're outside, we need to pay highly when there's squirrels and dogs and people and buses and so much excitement. Or if we have a dog who's nervous outside and maybe fearful, these are the times where we want to bring out kind of the big guns of the treat world. So things like hot dogs or cheese, fishy stuff, chicken stuff, deli, turkey, and ham. A lot of these kind of fresh, meaty type things or cheesy type things tend to be some of our highest value treats. Keep in mind, it depends on the dog. I met a dog the other day who did not care at all about cheese. And there are other dogs who don't care about hot dogs, but cheese is their number one reinforcer. For some dogs, it's as specific as, I like mozzarella, not Gouda. You know, every dog is going to have their own interpretation. So this is not a hard and fast rule. But if you're working and your dog is not taking treats and you can't do training, if you haven't tried some of the things on this list, this is a good place to kind of start seeing if you have something that is in the similar kind of range of things, the meats, the cheeses, the really stinky stuff. These tend to be our highest value and are going to be the most successful when we're in a tough environment or when something is hard for our dogs. Some of our medium value treats tend to be things like our freeze-dried stuff or our training treats. Again, they're small, they're kind of stinky, stuff like that, but it's not quite as exciting. Again, for some dogs, they might have something like that freeze-dried salmon that might be their favorite thing in the entire world. It just depends. But these tend to be kind of somewhere in the middle for our dogs. And then when we look at low value, so again, a lot of times families tell me, oh, my dog won't listen, he won't take treats. And they're working with something like this. So any of our kind of biscuit type, our hard, less stinky, these kinds of treats tend to be lower value. And again, I say it depends. My dog really likes a little crunchy treat, not so much like these milk bones, but there are some really nice crunchy treats that are like blueberry flavored and things like that that are not meaty at all. She really likes those, but a lot of the time, these kinds of things tend to be low value. And it's the same for things like our kibble or anything that kind of seems like it's a kibble. So keep that in mind that, every dog has their own sort of spectrum. It's not like every dog has the same basic ideas, but for the most part, dogs tend to fall a little bit into these categories. And so you can use that to your advantage when you're trying to figure out what you need to pay them for a particular behavior or in that environment. Another thing that I want to talk about in addition to how heavily we're reinforcing them with a particular value of food is this is where we get a little bit into the science of things. Here, you do not need to know what all of these things mean. You do not need to think about the whole sort of science every time you're training your dog, but I want you to know that there is a couple things that influence how our dogs are willing to take treats and what they're willing to do based on when we give them rewards. So when we talk about these different schedules of reinforcement, we're talking about how often we give them a treat for doing something that we liked. So for example, we might say every time the dog sits, we give them a treat. Or we might say every 5 times they sit, we give them a treat. So we're working on those ratios, or it could be something like an interval where as long as they're sitting down or as long as they're laying down, we might give them a treat every 10 seconds. We can also vary it. So maybe we say, okay, I'm going to reinforce you somewhere between 5 and 10 seconds. Each time it'll be a little bit different, but it's somewhere in there. And the key here is that when you look at this graph, you see that each of the different lines ends up with some kind of different looking pathways. So there are things like that orange fixed interval schedule, which says, okay, if I am giving you a reward every 5 times you do the behavior, we start to get this weird scallop effect. And so the way that we think about this is kind of like if you have a homework assignment that's due every Sunday night, suddenly there's a lot of work being done on Sunday night, and then not a whole lot probably Monday and Tuesday, right? So we get a gap in what they're doing because they know they're not going to get reinforced for it for a while. So it's worth waiting towards the end of the week. There's no reason to do it on Monday. You don't get the reward of getting that grade, getting things done until it hits that Sunday. So keep that in mind when we're using treats, that we want to be smart about when and how often we're giving our treats, because it can impact what we're seeing. So it might be that our dogs figure out like, this isn't going to get me a treat this time. There's no point in me doing it if I know I'm not going to get rewarded for another 15 seconds, 20 seconds, things like that. So it's something to be really thoughtful about. The other thing that comes up sometimes is people ask, well, how long should I reinforce for? And what should I do? Do I want to give treats for forever? And so one of the things to mention here is what's called the partial reinforcement effect. So when we're teaching a new behavior and we want it to be really strong, we reward every single time. We want the strongest possible behavior we can. And so we can do that by reinforcing all the time. As we get to a point where that behavior is stable, maybe our dog has already learned to sit and is doing it reliably. Maybe we don't give a treat every single time that they do it for us. Maybe we vary it. And that turns into kind of the slot machine idea where they know, okay, it's worth sitting because sometimes I'll get a reinforcer, but I don't know how often. And so this is something that can impact how and when we give treats and whether our dogs are excited about them and whether we're going to get the behavior we want out of that. So keep that in mind, that when we're teaching a new behavior, giving a treat every single time will give you that really nice upward trend so that they're really learning the behavior well. And then at some point when we want to say, okay, I can't continue to give a treat every single time for this, we want to vary it up so that they're willing to keep trying versus saying, oh, no more treats, I'm done, I'm never doing this again. So thinking about these reinforcement schedules, even though it's not something that most of us think of intuitively outside of, you know, the academic space, it's still impacting how we do things with our dogs. Another thing that really matters when we talk about how to get our dogs to take treats is the matching law. And so this is another scientific principle, and it basically tells us that you get what you pay for. So when it comes to asking our dogs to do things and taking treats, we have to do that same doggy math. So for example, if my dog is, you know, hanging out doing nothing and I have a piece of kibble, she'll probably take the piece of kibble. But if I'm asking her to pay attention to me when the world is really exciting, it's going to take more than a piece of kibble. The same thing is true for if we're asking them for something hard, just like if you asked a friend for a favor once, that would be different than if you ask them for a favor every single week. You know, they might start to say, okay, I need more than a couple slices of pizza. So the matching law really tells us that we are going to get responses based on how much we're paying for them. And so this becomes really important when we do training, not only for thinking about when do we need to pay more, but maybe when can we afford to pay less? And we'll talk about that a little bit later in using our treats wisely and using our high value treats wisely so that we get our dogs really interested in taking them when they're available. Another thing with this that's really important, that's not specifically related to taking treats, but I think it's really useful for us, is this idea of differential reinforcement. So again, another scientific term, but all it means is if we reward one thing better than another, we're likely to see that first thing more often. So when we have a dog who does something like jump up on visitors, we often teach them to sit for visitor attention instead, and we reward the heck out of it. And so at some point when they see a visitor, they go, I have two choices. I could jump up on them, which has not gotten me attention or treats, or I can sit, which has gotten me attention and treats. And so differential reinforcement has taught this dog it is way better to sit because the rewards are better there. So we're paying more for that behavior versus the other one, so they're going to choose that. Sometimes it happens too where this might get in our way. For example, if our dog is in the kitchen and we're cooking and we wish that they would be out of the kitchen, maybe we give them treats for being out of the kitchen, but if they stay in, there's a chance we'll get annoyed with them and we'll toss them a piece of chicken. They're getting much better reinforcement for staying in the kitchen. So keep in mind this differential reinforcement as you're training things to make sure that it's actually working in your favor and that you're getting what you're asking for from your dog. But remember, you get what you pay for. So another really big part that influences whether your dog will take treats is the idea of motivating operations. So motivating operations are something that we often don't talk about in just the dog training world, but are very important when we get into the academic side of things. And I wish that we talked about it more in dog training. The whole idea of a motivating operation is that it is something that makes the value of your reinforcer better or worse in that moment. So some really common examples of this are things like satiation and deprivation. If your dog is really, really hungry and they haven't gotten their breakfast yet, and it's first thing in the morning and they're so excited about food, they're going to be way more excited about any of your food reinforcers. If you're the dog on the right who maybe just ate an entire full meal and is passed out, you know, in the food coma, that dog is not going to work very hard for your treats, right? So using the motivating operation of saying, I want a dog who maybe is not super full, has not just been satiated on this. So motivating operations fall into these two sides where they're either increasing or decreasing the value of that reinforcer. And so we have to be really cautious about that, because either we can make things work better in our favor or we can make them worse in our favor. There are a bunch of other motivating operations that are common. Some of them are things like escape from heat and cold. Like if I'm really hot, I'm way more likely to be motivated for a cup of ice water than if I'm really cold. So there are some of these things that also impact our reinforcers, but because we're talking about treats today, we're going to talk mostly about things like satiation and deprivation. I do want to be really clear here. There are absolutely people, trainers, sometimes not trainers, who will advocate for things like depriving your dog of all food for days at a time to make them so hungry that they'll do anything. We are not advocating for that, right? So that is something that we find to be very unethical. There are a couple of things that we can do very ethically. So one of the things might be to say, okay, if we need to do training on our morning walk, don't give breakfast right before the walk, give it right after, right? So this does not have to be like, oh my gosh, we're depriving them. It could just be they're a little hungry. Like they're just, it's that time, like it's right before dinner time. Let's do a training session because they're going to be more motivated by our treats then. And being really aware that if our dog has just eaten a big snack, probably not as likely to want to do training, especially not if you have more boring treats. This is also true for things like toys. So if your dog is really excited about toy play or really excited about attention, things like that, they're going to be more excited to get that when they haven't had it for a little bit. The other thing about deprivation and satiation is that variety makes a big difference. So we have this kind of cornucopia on the bottom, which are not all foods that dogs should eat, but just there to demonstrate a variety of things. If our dog eats hot dogs every single day, will it lose value? Probably. I always say I love filet mignon, but if I had it every single day, I probably wouldn't be that excited about it. As it is, I get it like once a year. And so it's really high value for me. And so that's something that we want to take into account as well, where it's not just that hot dogs are high value, but if I have hot dogs and chicken and turkey and blueberries, if I'm rotating through things, then my dog is still going to be deprived of that specific thing, even if he's not necessarily super hungry. So we can still use this motivating operation to make it really exciting to get this specific food item, even if it has nothing to do with, when we train or how much food they've had, things like that. So keep in mind both of those components, both being smart and saying, I'm going to train while they're a little bit hungry, right? Again, we're not depriving them of food and taking their food away. We're just saying, if they're going to eat anyway, might as well get some value out of it for training. The only other caveat that I'll put in there is that there are some ethical concerns to asking dogs to do things that maybe they wouldn't otherwise do safely because they're hungry. And so even with small amounts of deprivation, if we have a dog who is feeling unsafe or fearful, and we're trying to use a motivating operation to make food really high value, to coerce them into stuff that they don't feel safe doing, that's not cool. But it can be really helpful when we're trying to get our dogs to learn new behaviors and trying to help them develop safe behaviors. So just keep that in mind, that there are some ways that we can impact the value of our reinforcers this way. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea of Contra freeloading. This is something that is really fascinating and really cool about our dogs and about a number of other animals as well. Again, scientific term, but all it means is that dogs will sometimes choose to do more work to get the food on their own. So we have done studies where, for example, we give dogs a bowl of food and a food puzzle with food, and it's the same food, they're the same distance away, but doing the food puzzle takes a lot more effort than just going and eating out of the bowl. And in some of these cases, we find that the dogs actually choose the food puzzle. And so to some degree, this doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you do extra work if you didn't have to? But we do find that in some cases, our animals and sometimes even humans enjoy the work of doing the thing and doing the foraging and getting into it. And so that's another thing that sometimes we find can be useful. My dog, for example, is really bad at some food puzzles and does not know how to figure them out. And she gets frustrated really easily and will abandon all hope. She's not going to eat the food. Other dogs might not be super food motivated for their regular kibble, but you put it in a snuffle mat and suddenly they're really excited about it. So sometimes finding a way that they can do some work for their food, but in a way that uses some of their biological functions, like they're sniffing, they're pawing, they're digging, rooting out, things like that. Sometimes that can be really helpful for actually increasing the value of that food. Oh goodness. It's trying. Come on, computer. There we go. Okay. So if your dog is not taking treats, we've talked about a number of things that can make your treats more valuable, that can make them more valuable in the meantime, and which treats you might want to use and how often you should be using them to get the best value from them. But managing the environment tends to be one of the other major causes for dogs not taking food. So again, if I am in an environment with lots and lots of distractions or an environment that's kind of stressful, I'm going to need way better treats than if I'm in that boring room where there's nothing in it. So we have to keep in mind that there are different treats for different purposes, right? So my dog Nina will maybe train for kibble in my house when there's nothing else happening. If we are outside, that is not going to cut it. She might sit or look at me for some medium value treats. But if there are other dogs around and she's getting really excited or maybe reactive, that is when she is going to need a high value treat. So these are things to keep in mind. The other thing is you reach a point where you don't have treats that can beat the environment. So we're looking at kind of this balance scale. And if we don't have treats that can beat the environmental stimulus, we shouldn't be in that environment, right? There are absolutely settings that we can't avoid, right? Life happens. Sometimes we're in a situation where our dog is reacting to someone who came around a corner and we weren't prepared. But in general, if we're finding that our dog will not take treats and we're using our highest value treats and they won't take them in a certain environment, then it is our goal to stay out of that environment until we can figure out some alternative strategies. Because there's a certain point where it's like, you know, if my dog spotted a goose right in front of her or something really exciting like that, there's no treat in the world at this point that would help me with that unless she had really strong behaviors around it. So anytime we're finding that we don't have treats that can compete with the environment, we want to manage the environment until we can teach our dog really, really solid skills. The other thing is fear and anxiety. And I think this is really commonly confused with things like just not paying attention and being really distracted, right? So sometimes people say, oh, my dog won't listen to me and he won't take treats, you know, because he's stubborn. And what we see is a dog who looks like this guy and is just really, really afraid in that environment. We know that when we get really stressed out, our sympathetic nervous system kicks in and we get this rush of adrenaline and cortisol, and our body says, oh my gosh, fight or flight, you know, protect yourself. And in that moment, we do not want to eat things, right? It is specifically against our biology. You know, when our biology says you're not safe, it's not going, oh, let's forage for things. It's going, we have to use all of our energy to safely make it out of this conflict. And so when our dogs are really fearful or anxious, they're in a heightened state, they're not going to be able to take treats. In fact, we can often use treats as a way to gauge how they're recovering by saying, okay, you know, it's been 30 seconds since we heard that really loud noise. He is now willing to take treats. That tells us he's starting to calm down, right? So sometimes we can use taking treats as a sign that our dogs are getting calmer. But if your dog is regularly not taking treats in a certain environment, we want to think about whether it's an issue of distraction or an issue of anxiety or fear. This is another really big one. Bribing and prediction. So we often find that when we offer food in the wrong order, we can actually burn out the relationship between our dog and that food. So key example here is that I had a client who told me that her dog was afraid of peanut butter. And I could not figure out what they meant. And so when I asked more questions, what they said was, what we would do before is we would get a spoon with peanut butter. We would use that to lure the dog into the bathroom. We would give it a bath. And now when we get a spoon of peanut butter, the dog runs away and hides. And so what we have here is a really big problem where the peanut butter has now become a predictor that bad things are going to happen. For this dog, baths were scary. And we were using it as a bribe and a lure to get them to do something we knew they didn't want to do. So we created this really big problem where peanut butter was no longer a reinforcer. It was actually aversive for the dog. The dog did not want to be anywhere near that peanut butter because it predicted bad stuff. And so we want to be really cautious about that. So here, again, what they had been doing was giving the treat and then trying to take the dog for a bath. And thus the treat became the predictor of bad things. And so they lost the ability to give peanut butter. What we want to do instead is, if we're going to do something that we want them to like more, so we want them to be more comfortable with baths, we want to look at things like, we gave you the bath and then you got something really good. Although ideally we would do that in small portions, where it might be something like, I take out the bath towels and you get a good thing, or I turn on the water from another room and you get a good thing, so that we're not just totally panicking our dogs. That's a topic for another time. But in general, we want to think about making sure that the treats are following up the thing, and that we are not setting ourselves up for a situation where we're going to lose the value of our food. So in the case that I just mentioned, what I asked the folks to do was actually just put some peanut butter down, like on a bowl or on the ground. And of course, the dog came by and loved the peanut butter. It was no longer in the spoon. The human had walked away. It wasn't predicting anything bad. And so we were able to get the value back of this peanut butter so that we could use it for other things. But we had temporarily poisoned it by saying, oh, if you get the peanut butter, it's a sign of bad stuff. So if your dog is not taking treats, especially if it's something like you're trying to coax them into doing something, our dogs are smart enough to see through that after a couple of times, and it's likely that you will lose the value of that food, and it could take some significant effort to get that back. So don't burn your high value treats by making this mistake. It's something that many of us have made at some point or another. Recognize when it's happening and do what you can to kind of reverse that pathway. Okay, so another thing that often comes up is, what do I do if I'm a vegetarian and I do not want to carry around hot dogs? Some people who are vegetarian are doing it for reasons and feel comfortable, still handling things like deli turkey. Some people just absolutely cannot tolerate it. Cool. All right, there's some other things that we can do that are vegetarian. So some of our really high value things tend to be things like cream cheese or that peanut butter or easy cheese, which is ridiculous and overly expensive, but a super high value reinforcer for a lot of dogs. You can also use eggs, whether that's like hard boiled eggs or fried eggs, cut up obviously into little pieces. There are also things like yogurt, baby food. There are tons of versions of this. Again, there are meaty versions and things like apple and other stuff like that, but they tend to be pretty high value. And sweet potatoes, another great one. A lot of folks will just slice up sweet potatoes and bake them into kind of little chips. And for a lot of dogs, that can be fairly high value. Again, it depends on what you're working on. And there are some cases where, man, we just do not have great reinforcers. And somebody says, okay, you know what, I'll tolerate it. We'll do chicken. It just kind of depends on the case, but there are absolutely things that we can do if you're like, I do not feel good handling, fresh turkey. Totally cool. The other thing is, what if you're vegan? And this is a thing that happens as well. So again, if you're a vegetarian, using things like our cheese and our eggs can be really high value. If you're vegan, you're a little bit more limited if you're not comfortable handling those things. So some things you can try. There are a bunch of different fruits and vegetables that may be exciting for your dogs. Again, it totally depends. And you just have to kind of cross your fingers and hope that one of these things will be a workaround for your dog. For a lot of dogs, these things are not going to be super high value, right? So if I have a dog and I'm working on something like reactivity or aggression or fear, I'm probably not going to pull out the bananas and the green beans first. But if I don't have access to other things, they might be the choices that we go with. And you never know. There are some dogs that love ice cubes. There are some dogs that like things like popcorn. I had a dog who really liked Cooler Ranch Doritos. And I remember a trainer telling me that they had a dog who really liked teriyaki chicken specifically. So there are a variety of options that you can try. It's just a matter of finding things that will work for your dog. And again, pumpkin and sweet potato can often be good ideas for those guys. So what about special diets? This is another place where, right, big in the middle, talk to your vet. So as your trainer, I am never going to tell you, forget what your vet said. It's totally okay to give them this food. That is not how things work. I am not a veterinarian. Your trainer is not a veterinarian. We can tell you, ooh, it's going to be really hard to work on some of these things if we don't have a high value reinforcer. And we might recommend that you talk to your vet about, okay, what kinds of things can your dog eat? So depending on what's going on, your dog may be on a special diet of a variety of things. So they might be on something like this hydrolyzed protein diet that's pretty specific. You could be doing an allergy trial where you're not allowed to eat anything else. They might just be allergic to chicken. There might be a variety of things that control their diet. So these are conversations that you want to have with your vet in terms of what kinds of things can you include safely, right? And sometimes we might say, we're going to hold off on training for 6 weeks while we finish this diet trial, because that way we'll know and we'll be able to use things safely, right? So depending on what's going on, we may choose to wait. One thing that I did want to mention is if you are on something like the hydrolyzed protein diet, especially if all of the other foods are pretty much ruled out, if you're doing one of those elimination diets to see what they might be having a reaction to, and there's really nothing they can eat except for the hydrolyzed protein diet, one of the things that people will often do is use the wet food rather than the kibble. And so sometimes people will bake it into, little cookie type things, or bake it on a flat sheet and then break it up into little pieces. Or you can blend it up with something like a little bit of water and put it in a squeeze tube. So these are some ways that it's still the same nutrition, right? You're not adding anything else. You're not getting in the way of the veterinary work you're doing. But if you are truly limited to the hydrolyzed diet of just the kibble and the wet food, getting a little creative with the wet food to create some, crunchy things and some soft, squishy things can often be a really helpful workaround. Delivery methods. Okay, so this makes a big difference for some dogs. There are dogs who are all about taking the treats from your hand, but will not take them off the ground. And there are dogs who are the exact opposite. So we want to think about where we give our food to get our dogs most likely to take it and to protect ourselves in the process. So if you have a dog who is likely to bite a finger off while you're trying to give them treats, those are dogs where I might default to tossing treats either on the ground or tossing them to the dog so that my hands are not in the way, or at least until I can give them some better habits around taking treats, right? So tossing them on the ground is often really helpful. There are a lot of times where I like tossing treats for the movement. So for example, if I'm teaching a dog to come sit, I want them to stand up in between so that they will sit again, so that I can reward them again. So I might toss a treat on the ground that forces them to stand up so they can come back and sit. If I just feed a treat to their mouth while they're still sitting, where do we go from here, right? We can't reset to a new behavior. I also really like it for adding in movement or play. So if we're trying to get our dog actively engaged in something, tossing treats can be really helpful. If we're having a rainy day and maybe I'm doing some training with my dog and I'm not going to have time for a walk, it's really pouring down outside, I might do some games where every time my dog is getting a treat, I'm tossing it all the way across the living room. So she's going to go run and get it, come back. She's getting some play. She's getting some exercise. So thinking about that can be really helpful. It can also be really helpful, again, for getting our dogs to actually take the treat. So one of the examples that I like to give is with reactive dogs. So say you have a dog who gets really fixated when they see another dog. So they see it and we see the ears go up and they just kind of stare and they get stuck. So in those cases, there are dogs where I am taking high value treat and shoving it at their face in the hopes that they will actually swallow it and go, oh, there's food here, and disconnect for a second. So sometimes delivering it directly to their mouth can be really, really helpful for a dog who's kind of stuck. We also have dogs who, even once they get unstuck a little bit, they still want to orient and be this kind of stiff dog staring at the thing. And so I might want to move away and keep going. Or maybe I see another dog coming, or a pack of dogs coming the other direction, and I'm like, shoot, we got to get out of here. So these are times where I like delivering to the ground, where I can toss the treat ahead of me in the direction that I want to go. So my dog's going to do a little game of pouncing on the treat to get it. And she's going to look up at me, and we pounce on the treat to get it. So we're moving as we go. And so this not only gets us moving in the direction we want to go, but for some dogs, the game part of it is actually more interesting than just the treat. So remember when we talked about Contra freeloading, this idea that it's not just the value of the treat, but if it's now a game, if it's, flopping along the ground, if they have to look for it and chase it or sniff it out of the grass, those things can make it more valuable too. Again, it depends on the dog and the situation, but I highly recommend that we practice those things when we're outside to see if one way works better than the other, or if they work better in certain situations. So another thing that can be helpful when we talk about how to get our dog to take treats and how to use treats wisely is what kinds of treats we're giving them. So there are great things like squeeze tubes or the easy cheese that are really good for Sharky dogs, right? Because that way I don't have a finger there. I'm not holding a morsel of something. They can be really great for sort of a continuous delivery where I need to just keep the dog moving. But one of the other things I've found myself talking about a bunch recently is using a remote feeder. So the Manners Minder is just an example of one of the treat dispensers. You put in something that is kibble-like. So you can't use like your hot dogs in this. It's more of like the harder treats. But you put it in this thing and you get a remote control, and from across the room or from in a different room, you press the little button and a treat comes out of it. And this can be really great for times where you want to be able to reward your dog, but you don't necessarily want to be standing next to it. So for example, if your dog constantly begs at the table and you're trying to train them that at dinner time, they should go and lay on their bed, this is a great way. You have this next to it while you're sitting at the dinner table. You can press that button whenever you feel like it, and a little treat pops out, and your dog is getting fed for staying on their bed while you're over at the dinner table. So keep this in mind, that sometimes if you're having a situation where you want to be able to reward, but you can't figure out the logistics, sometimes using a delivery method like this can be really effective. And I do really like using things like these squeeze tubes or anything else like this because it's different. So again, switching it up from like, hey, you get this little piece of something to you suddenly get to take a lick off of this exciting thing can be really different for some dogs. And it fits that variety that makes it a motivating operation that says, wow, this is even more valuable because it's different from what I normally get. So another common thing is I don't know how to treat my dog because I have a 5-pound Yorkie and I am 6'2". What can I do? So when you are trying to reward a dog who is really, really tiny and thus far away from you when you're going and doing things like going for a walk, there are a few things. One is you can put your treats on the ground, right? So you can toss your treats. That always works. If you're doing things where you don't want to toss them, so say you're working on leash walking and you want to reward your dog right by your side instead of having them chase a treat and maybe not being sure exactly where that treat's going to go, using a long handled wooden spoon can actually be a really great solution. So we often will take things like peanut butter, yogurt, cream cheese, something like that, freeze a bunch of it on the end of the spoon. And then whenever we're ready to reward, we just flop the spoon down, they take a lick off of it, and then the spoon comes back up. So it just gives you a little bit more length on your arm, and it can be helpful for these kinds of things. If somebody wants to invent some way of like dropping a treat down some kind of machine so that you can use hot dogs for your tiny dogs, let me know. We get asked about it all the time. But in the short term, using this kind of thing can be really helpful. And again, it's something that we don't normally do with our dogs. And so that can be really exciting. And you can put different things on the spoon whenever you're going to work on this stuff. So situational, one of the other things that comes up a lot with taking treats are these really high stress environments. So say you have a dog who does not do well seeing new people and you have like an elevator ride, or you have a short hallway until you can get outside the apartment complex. There is some short period or short area that you have to just get through, and your dog is not going to take regular treats out there. It's too exciting. There's too much stuff going on. Using things like baby food or a tub of cream cheese, easy cheese, any of these things, the way we often do that is basically holding it down in front of their face. It is super exciting. We start it right before we have to go through that gauntlet, and then we just hold it in front of their face, lure them through that point, and then we're done. So this is not necessarily I'm going to train you to learn a new fun behavior. This is I need to manage you through this really tough environment, and it is really hard to get you to take treats. But if I can give you something in front of your face that you can continually get, that's really exciting and only used for that purpose, it can be really helpful. So some of our shelter volunteers might be familiar with something like this when they're just trying to get the dog through the kennel building to the outside, where they don't use the cream cheese during training, but they do have the tub of cream cheese right in that dog's face as they're moving through the building so that they can get out safely. So sometimes that is a really good solution for a dog that is unwilling to take most treats in that really high stress situation. Well, okay, preventing weight gain. So we've talked a lot about things like cream cheese and peanut butter and turkey and chicken, and all of this stuff adds up. So we want to make sure that we do not create some other problems for our dogs, namely things like weight gain, because that can be really problematic for our dogs in a lot of ways. So a few tips within this. One of them is that if your dog is willing to work for their kibble, even just in some situations, use that. So for example, when we deal with baby puppies, they're 8 weeks old, we rarely use other treats except in maybe things like a puppy class, but at home and for all of their regular walks and things, it is kibble because they're so excited about life. Everything is amazing. They're totally willing to work for kibble most of the time. So if we can get away with using kibble, use it. And I would say the same is generally true with most of our reinforcers. We want to use the lowest value we have and the highest nutrition we have. So not to say that you should be using, bacon strips and like crunchy crackers for your dog all the time. But if you can get closer to a kibble-like thing that has good nutritional value versus just giving them a ton of hot dogs, we would rather use low value and closer to good nutrition whenever possible. So keep that in mind, that we want to pay the lowest amount we can in order to get the bang for our buck. That also has a benefit because it helps with that same motivating operation, right? So if they're mostly getting low value stuff, then they're getting the high value stuff less frequently, which is going to mean that they're deprived from that thing, which again, deprivation from roasted chicken, it's not a super deprivation, but it's a motivating operation for them, right? So it makes that chicken really valuable. So it can also help us with training, but it does make sure that we're not just giving them a whole bunch of stuff that's, potentially going to lead to lots of diarrhea and eventually to weight gain. Another thing to keep in mind as a pro tip is that sometimes I will mix the really high value stuff with some stuff that's maybe not so high value. So for example, if I have a dog who I know really likes hot dogs, but maybe shouldn't have, 5 hot dogs worth in a training session, what I might do is take some kibble or some treats that are sort of medium value and put them in a bag with some hot dog pieces and leave it in the fridge overnight. That means that all of the stuff in that bag is going to start to taste like hot dogs. Some of the juices are going to infiltrate the other pieces of food in there. So it gives us the ability to make a whole bunch of kind of low value stuff taste a lot higher value without just adding more calories and more salt and stuff like that. So that is one of my favorite tricks to try and get a little bit more bang for my buck out of some not so awesome treats. And again, that's helpful for weight gain, but it's also helpful if I'm like, oh, we got a big training session and we're going to have some not so great poops later if I give them all of this in boiled chicken. So we want to try and vary things up and use easier on the stomach foods wherever we can. The other thing is that you all know that 3 + 1 = 4. This is a thing that we need to keep in mind when we're doing training. And so if we know that they're supposed to get, a certain number of calories or a certain amount of food per day, we want to be cautious to make sure that we're adding up to that amount with our training and with our feeding. So this can mean a couple of things. One of them is it might mean, I'm training that puppy, maybe they get half their meals are in their, bowls and slow feeders and Kongs and things like that, but the other half we're using for training, right? So I'm just taking part of it out of their normal intake. There might also be times where, say my dog and I are out for a walk and we see a bunch of dogs, so we're doing a bunch of training around reactivity work. I'm going to feed her a little bit less at dinner because she got a lot of calories as we were doing our training. And again, be cautious about this. It's not like we can suddenly substitute, 6 hot dogs a day and no kibble, right? It's not just about calories. Please talk to your vet, make good decisions about the health of your dog. But in general, we want to make sure that we're not just adding more food. So I will sometimes have clients who are starting to do training on things like reactivity and fear, where we need some really high value treats. And then 3 days later, I get an email that's like, oh my gosh, Fluffy won't eat. I'm going to take him to the vet. Like, he won't eat anything. Everything is terrible. And what they're not realizing sometimes is that suddenly their dog is getting a whole bunch of really good snacks and really good stuff and doing all this training. And so they're just not hungry because they've already exceeded the amount that they would normally be eating. So we want to make sure when we're using treats for different stuff that we're really cautious about how much intake our dog is supposed to be getting overall, both nutritionally and in terms of calories, and making sure that we're trying to stay within that and just adjusting how much food they're getting and how many treats they're getting. Again, treat not necessarily meaning fancy, junk food. Treat could also be kibble, but in terms of training, right? So reinforcement, we just want to make sure that we're balancing that out. So there might be some days where they get most of their food from training and just a little bit in, regular meals, or we might find that some days it's the opposite way. So we just want to keep that in mind and make sure that we're not falling into the trap of giving a ton of this food in training and then not knowing why our dog won't eat, or just continuing to feed them and not knowing why they suddenly look like they swallowed themselves. So we want to make sure that we keep our dogs healthy during this process, and it can absolutely make them not want to eat. Again, if they have access to really high value stuff and then we try and give them a bunch of kibble, they're going to go, I'm just going to hold out for the ham, right? So we want to keep that in mind, that can sometimes be a reason that they won't eat or won't take treats, is that they are already full and have better treats that they've been given. And so now they're like, I'm not going to eat this one. I'll just wait for the next training session. So in summary, there are a bunch of different ways that we can adjust when it comes to using treats. So one of them is deciding how much and how often we're going to reward, right? So new behaviors we want to reward every single time. Once they're stable, we might decide to vary it up a little bit. And we know that we might have to give more or bigger rewards for harder things and use the right value. So using the high enough value to be able to compete with something, especially if there's distraction or fear involved, and making sure that we don't overuse that one. We don't need hot dogs for most dogs to learn how to sit inside. We're just losing the value of those hot dogs. We know we need to control the environment. That is one of the biggest factors, is that we have our dog in an environment that they cannot handle, and we don't have treats that are high enough value to compete with that. And that might be because we have the wrong treats. It might be because the environment is just too distracting for our dog or just too scary for our dog, and we don't have treats that are good enough to manage that, which tells us we just need to not be in that environment. We want to use the right treat delivery system. So that might mean things like the tub of cream cheese to get our dog through a tough spot. It might mean tossing treats when we want our dog to reset, or we want them to move in a specific direction, or putting treats directly to their mouth if we think they're maybe staring at something and maybe won't notice or look away to see the treat. we want to keep our dogs healthy. We want to make sure that we're not overfeeding and that we're cautious about how much food they're getting through these training exercises. And we want to make sure we're using satiation and deprivation to our advantage. So again, this does not mean just stop feeding your dog to make him do what you want. This does mean things like, can I take advantage of the fact that he hasn't eaten yet this morning? So let's go do our training exercises now. It'll be fun for him. We'll get that Contra freeloading because he's doing some fun stuff for it. And use that to your advantage versus, oh, my dog, just played for 2 hours and ate a big meal and did all the cool stuff. And now he won't listen to me. He doesn't care about treats or toys or any of these things. So we want to use these things to our advantage and make sure that we pay attention to that and the variety, in that even the best treat, if we give it to them all the time, can lose some of its value. So with that, I'm going to unshare my screen if I can figure out how to do that. And if you guys have questions, I will take them now. As I mentioned, this will be recorded and it will be put on YouTube tomorrow. So if you have questions, just throw them up in the chat box and I will answer those. In the meantime, quick reminders, we are a nonprofit. Donations help us keep offering the things that we do. We do low cost training consultations, private training, and dog training classes here in Austin. We have webinars every month. The next one is T-Touch in December. We have lots of fun events coming up and things like that. If you're not already part of our newsletter, I highly recommend doing that. And then if you'd like a cool t-shirt that says dog training is for everyone, we sell those on our website as well. Any questions you have, please feel free to email me anytime. And we're happy to help. And yes, the loss of novelty and value for high value treats is definitely a thing. Sometimes it's easier to think about it in terms of like the thing that you love. I love chocolate, but once as a 12-year-old, I ate chocolate probably every day for like a week in large quantities and did not eat chocolate for a very long time. So I think, some of these things we definitely just have to think from our own perspective of what would make us really excited about something. And so using deprivation in that sense can be really helpful. But yeah, as you come up with questions, definitely let us know. We can always help through private consulting, but also, we post stuff on our Instagram all the time. So definitely keep watching through there and stay tuned for future webinars. So thank you so much for coming out tonight and we'll see you soon. Okay, bye.